Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Political Potatoes. I'm your host, Gregory Graf, and today we are joined by Ozzie Knezovich. Ozzie is the former sheriff of Spokane County, was there for many years. Ozzie, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Greg.
I've known you for a long time. I think I first met you in 2019. I remember going to Spokane and visiting you, and there's something I'll never forget. You were wearing a 1911 and it was like a cross straw. If I remember right, it was almost like an upside down cross straw configuration. I thought that was really cool. As your personal carry weapon, I was very impressed with that. So, Ozzie, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Greg, I was born and raised in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, and I graduated from Rock Springs High School. From there, I went to college, joined the United States Army after graduating college, and was lucky enough to come home, start my law enforcement career here. Started in a very small town of Superior, Wyoming, and then got hired by the city of Rock Springs and served with the city of Rock Springs Police Department for 4 years, and had to make a hard choice around that time. Pay wasn't all that great at the time in law enforcement in Wyoming, and retirement was not very good. So had a growing family, and in order to keep up with the bills and everything, we decided to move, went to the city of Olympia first, and then my son's asthma didn't do too well on the wet side, so spent 27 years in Spokane County at the sheriff's office, and the last 17 of that as the elected sheriff of Spokane County, Washington.
And where are you now?
I'm currently retired, moved back home to Wyoming. I live about 1.5 miles outside of Superior again, and I'm currently the volunteer police chief for the city of Superior, Wyoming. In December 23, I got a knock on the door and opened it, and it was the mayor of Superior, and he asked me if I'd be their police chief, and I went, wait a minute, I'm retired. What's the issue? And he said, drugs. And the Sweetwater County Sheriff's Office doesn't have a drug unit. They won't come up and help us. And I said, okay, if you can make this a volunteer position, I'll go back and get my Wyoming certificate. And I did, and been working with DCI, the Department of Criminal Investigations for the state of Wyoming, and we've been taking drug dealers off the streets of Superior. Just sent one to prison for 3 to 5 years. So when the sheriff here decided to retire, I decided to run for sheriff of Sweetwater County.
Wow. Okay. So that's your next step in your career here. So when you were in Spokane, and I know that my listeners, of course, a lot of them are in Idaho, and Coeur d'Alene is right there, stone's throw away from Spokane. And so many of them are familiar with your work there. Tell us a little about, what it was like being the sheriff of Spokane.
Being the sheriff of Spokane County was a challenge at times. But, I had a great relationship with the people of Spokane County, and great support. The Board of County Commissioners that I worked with were very supportive, and we were able to accomplish a lot of things in Spokane County, reduce the crime level up until about 2020, because after 2020, the state of Washington, quite frankly, in my opinion, lost its mind, and the very progressive woke influence was devastating for public safety, to the point that in 2021, the legislature passed a bill that I called Independence Day for the Felons, because it restricted our ability to protect the people of Spokane County and Spokane greatly. And it was fairly devastating. And the rest is what they call history. Since that time, the quality of life in the state of Washington, and especially in Spokane County, has cratered. Somebody sent me an article about a month and a half ago, Greg, and the article was concerning a poll that was done. And they said that 7 out of 10 Spokaneites were looking to leave the state of Washington.
Wow, and come to Idaho, I'm sure. We've gotten a lot of people. I think now Washington is the number one place that people are fleeing to move to Idaho. And then behind that, I think, is California. I know, because my new neighborhood everyone there is from Washington, California. I think there's only one person that in this new neighborhood that's only about 2 years old has one actual person that's born and raised in Idaho. It's kind of funny. Now, interesting. I remember flying into Coeur d'Alene, well, actually into Spokane, took an Uber into Coeur d'Alene, and the driver was telling me the story of how she had owned it's like an antique store or some sort of shop, this business she'd run. And it had gotten so bad because of the laws you're talking about, where that they couldn't do anything. Someone could just walk in and steal stuff. And they would just look at her in the face like, what are you going to do? They couldn't touch him. They called the police. Police aren't going to do anything. So she ended up having to hire like a private security guard. And that didn't even do much. Eventually that helped a little bit. The problem is it cut so much in her profits, she could barely stay into business. So she's doing this Uber driving to make up the difference to pay for the security guard because the police can't do anything because the laws in Washington make it so, theft is not prosecuted.
It's a harsh reality. And that is a true story. I mean, when I was sheriff, we heard this continually, especially in the city of Spokane. Not so much anywhere else, because in the jurisdictions that I had, and I had the unincorporated area and 9 contract cities, we enforced the theft laws and things like that. But, in 2011, the city of Spokane actually publicly announced, they were no longer going to investigate property crimes. And what resulted from that was chaos. And the sheriff's office, a lot of people don't understand this, that the elected sheriff, if they know that a jurisdiction within their county will not or cannot deal with a certain crime, the sheriff has to. And, that happened in like October of 11. By April of 2012, we had a lot of burglaries going on. Burglaries that they'd go into occupied houses, and they went into one house and kids had to hide under the beds and everything else. And I went and talked to the Florida County commissioners at the point and went, look, I need $50,000. I'm going to put an end to this, but I'll need $50,000 for the overtime. We actually formed a task force, and we dropped those burglaries down 56%. And it got to the point we followed one group up out of Spokane into Pend Oreille County, and we ended up arresting them there. And one of the detectives asked them, why'd you go to Pend Oreille County? Well, we know you're arresting everybody in Spokane County. So
they thought they had a friendly sheriff there.
Exactly.
I've never heard that story before.
Yeah. But, the reality is Washington has done this to themselves. I mean, it's to the point now that task force wouldn't have been effective because the judges automatically release these repeat offenders without bail, without bond, and it's like open season on citizens. And I used to chastise the progressive mindset in the city of Spokane and the 3rd Legislative District, which was in Spokane County, for basically creating nothing but victims. And, this woke aspect of not holding people accountable is killing that state. It's killing that state, Oregon, California, any state that has adopted this philosophy. Take a look at their crime, take a look at their going on, and you'll find the same thing.
So what did you find was effective in your policing tactics there in Spokane?
The most effective technique we had was I had deputies that cared. They cared about going and doing the job. They cared about the people, the leadership that cared about the people and wanting to make sure that the community was safe. And when you have that, you combine that with training, and we had one of the best training units in the United States. I mean, at one point we had a reputation internationally that we had people from Australia, Japan, Malaysia come to Spokane County to train there. And, it actually culminated in partnership with the U.S. Air Force, and we built a $45 million training center that trains both the Air Force personnel and local, state, and federal law enforcement in the region of Spokane. And, you combine dedicated people with the best training and the best training philosophies. Our intelligence unit was second to none. It actually became the backup intelligence unit for the state of Washington. And we combined our analysts with our detectives, and, that led to solving crimes and records that were really hard for other agencies to match.
Well, I remember reading, I think you had a video on your Facebook where you're talking about how you had a 17-year stretch where you didn't have a single homicide case that went uncleared. Which is phenomenal. That's amazing.
Yeah, that is true. Like I said, the dedication of that homicide unit and the detectives that worked in that unit, combined with the training that we provided them, the intelligence-led policing philosophies that we developed, bringing the analyst in, we're at times able to solve crimes almost real time. As they were happening, we'd be able to follow the perpetrators and solve these things in very, very short order.
Wow. Well, so how were you able to do that, if you can share?
Again, we had our analysts that were very, very into making sure that they were doing their homework on both the human intelligence side and the social media side. I mean, sadly, Greg, we had a series of gang shootings between September of 20, I believe it was, and March of 21. And our intelligence unit was able, and it's hard to word this correctly, but I'll just do it this way. They were so proficient that they knew who was going to get shot next based on the internet and the social media battles that the different gangs and different gang sets were having between each other. We found that there was a pattern of whoever was sending the rap music challenge in the next set, that person was probably the next person to be shot.
Fascinating. I mean, I know I watch social media often and, look for certain patterns and signals, specifically in the political realm here in Idaho. And yeah, I would agree. You can it's predictive, right? You see the patterns, I'm not saying someone's going to get shot, but you know who's going to be targeted next for a mean tweet or something like that. That's a very different story than the gang crime you would see. So what were some of your most profound experiences that really either shook you or you learned from or had a big impact on you?
One of them was actually the homicide that broke that 17-year streak that the unit had. That happened, I believe, was in February of 21, and it involved a drive-by shooting in the city of Spokane Valley. A 16-year-old male was gunned down in that drive-by shooting, and it bothers me that we weren't able to get him and his family justice. And sadly, there are people that know who did that, but the community, the gang community, and certain sectors of the community just stopped cooperating, and that was sad. It was sad to watch what happened. And in March of 21, the police chief of Spokane and I had a press conference because we had lost 6 kids in that September to March timeframe to drive-by shootings, and you might as well multiply that by 3 because you have 6 kids that died, but you had 3 times that went to prison for those crimes. So that's a double whammy for the community that was being affected. And after the press conference, the chief and I were literally called white supremacists because we used the word gang.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. I looked at
Did you not say trigger warning before you gave the press conference?
Like I said, it went ultra woke, and I just kind of shook my head and I went, let me get this straight. We're out here trying to prevent young African American males from dying, and at the same time trying to prevent young African American males from going to prison. And suddenly we become white supremacists for that. That just was amazing to hear. And I went, if that's what makes me a white supremacist, I guess I'll be a white supremacist if it means I can protect and I can save these young kids from being killed. And, we challenged the legislature and the woke city council and woke activists to get out of their chairs and come to the table and help us fix that issue. None of them ever did.
No, it's, in my opinion, mind-boggling the how labels get applied to people. I mean, I consider myself a longtime Republican conservative my whole life, right? But I get along and listen to a lot of different opinions and ideas. I'm not super rigid about that, and I don't believe in having an extreme position on something. And so on the left, I get called a Nazi. On the far right, I get called the rhino. Whatever. It's like, okay.
Yeah. Join the club. You and I share that, and you know that because you and I have talked about these things. I mean, the extreme left hates me. Antifa cannot stand me. The Democratic Socialists of America can't stand me.
Wait, they're a real thing?
Yeah. And the extreme right feels the same way. And I'm fine with that because I really don't like their ideologies at all because they're hurting America. They're hurting the people of America. And I've always said, and you've heard me say this many times, there are 80% of us stuck in the center of this thing, looking both directions, going, what happened? But the thing is, that 80% is starting to wake up. That 80% is starting to go, we've had enough. We want our country back. And we're done with you extremes. We want our country back, and we want things to go back to the central values that made us the greatest nation on earth. You know,
Exactly.
taking care of people and treating each other with respect, being able to have civil conversations, which is something that after November of 2016, you could not have.
Well, I love that you bring that up, right? And one of the things I talk about often in my writing in the show is defining extremism. And I remember a few years back, someone said, oh, he talks about extremism. Like, oh, I'm extremism because, I want you to go to church and have babies and all this stuff. Like, no, that's not how you define extremism. How you define extremism is not about any particular ideology. Extremism is defined by having a position on an ideology you believe in so firmly, and that you're so rigid in that belief that you are unmovable and will not listen to any other opinion, right? You're like, nope, shutting everything off. And then the next point that applies, which is really important, is that you're willing to take abusive action to enforce that ideology, whether it's being abusive and horrible to someone online or going so far as taking active violence or political violence towards them, right?
Or killing someone.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, let's just be very clear about that. We have gone from, being mean to bullying people, trying to counsel people, to killing them. And the polling is just amazing on this, where you have 55% of the left stating that it is okay to kill a political rival that thinks differently than you. We have gone so far in a very bad direction that, we need to, as a people, just start going, we're done. We're done with that. And I'll tell you that the election in Wisconsin, where the Democratic Socialists went down in flames, I think that they need to realize the American people are not that. We are not communists. We don't want that type of ideology in our country. And, sadly, there are footholds in the country that have that, but that is in select little groups of areas that the population of a certain mindset has reached a point where they become the majority, but they're really not the majority, Greg, because if people actually got out of their chairs and voted, these people wouldn't even be on the ballot.
Right. It's the loud minority of a political party or group, whatever, when they engage, and it's just been my experience, and you've seen this too, when they engage into these confrontational tactics, normal people who have been doing this for years, like, I'm out, right? I don't want to deal with this. I don't want anything to do with this nastiness. I didn't sign up for this. I'm just a volunteer. I'm not getting paid for it. They leave. And that's the point, right? And you see it on both sides. I'm not targeting an individual group, but it's, on the right and the left, on the edges. And then, of course, you see the horseshoe effect where you now
kind
see
of
people on the
right here.
Yeah, I hate this. I hate this. Oh, but we both hate the Jews. Like, okay, when did that happen? The anti-Semitism has just gone off the rails. It's insane. I support Israel, but now as a Republican saying that in some circles, like, ooh, you're bad, you're whatever. When did that become a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
One of our
exactly.
biggest allies in the Middle East. Why wouldn't we? Anyway, it's just gotten so difficult trying to help people understand, well, there's nuance in this, and there is, right? Not everyone is this. It's hard to label something because someone might be a anti-Semite, they might be a Christian nationalist and a conservative and a Republican, but not all four. Pick any one or two, right? And they're still, but they're not, you wouldn't say, well, they're a Nazi. Well, they don't like Hitler. Okay. So what are they? And it's not fair or accurate just to drop a monolithic label on them. And that's where it gets challenging because, as we both seen, there's a spectrum to it. And when it's so easy to just lump people into a group, same with the left, like, oh, well, all Democrats are evil because they support Antifa. I know a lot of Democrats, and none of them that I know of support Antifa or these fringe far right groups or far left groups because they're hurting their party too. As, the DSA people, the Democrat socialists or borderline leaning towards communism, and once again, a spectrum, and people argue, well, no, it's not this or this, whatever. It's an ideology that conflicts with what I believe are true American values, right? That we grew up with, the America we love and know. So back to your story, your history. You've dealt with living in a state and working in a state with, I would say, more extreme left laws in place, right? This is what happens when the left takes over a state legislature. And these are the things, the real world examples. A small business owner can't survive. Their business is going under because it's open season on crime. People can just take from them whatever they want, and they're not allowed to defend themselves. Now,
Exactly.
that doesn't happen in Idaho. That doesn't happen in Wyoming. That doesn't happen in Utah, because the people we elect have a very different mindset. Now, I don't agree with all of them. Some of them have some fringe ideas. We see this as a petri dish for bad ideas sometimes, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, people are moving to states like these because we have a long history of a particular, more traditional conservative lawmaking, right?
Exactly.
And so it becomes an attraction for people fleeing Washington, California, and they call themselves political refugees. Okay, we'll welcome you. We're good with that, but please don't try to change things, because we were good. We're already a conservative place before. We don't need more, whatever it is, your grievances with the left there.
Exactly, because what I always do, Greg, is I go, welcome here, but don't bring there here. Mm-hmm. You left there for a reason. Yeah. Don't bring those ideologies here, and just understand we have certain ideologies here that we protect very, very strenuously. And gun rights. Gun rights are extremely important. And as you know, you followed my career. I fought against that, the craziness of the state of Washington. Actually acted as expert witnesses when citizens sued the state over those gun laws, and was one of the few sheriffs in the United States to be endorsed by the NRA because of those stances against those gun laws. And, being back in Wyoming, I really enjoy being back in Wyoming.
I can have 30 rounds in my magazine, or 60 or 100 if I want, right? That's awesome.
But, I don't even have to worry about that. But I'll tell you, though, Greg, that is one of the major concerns that I hear on the campaign trail here is, what are you going to do? What are you going to? I'm like, this is Wyoming, folks. Back in my day, we had guns in the gun racks at the high school because we went hunting on the way home. I mean, that's just the way it is here. But the people are so afraid of that overreach that I'm like, look, bottom line, and you always hear it, what are you going to do if the federal government sends military or federal agents to come disarm us? Well, here's what happens. One, that means that the Second Amendment must have been removed because they can't do that. Or it means the Constitution has been thrown out the window. And at that point, we don't have the same America that we have today. And there's no way that anybody in the state of Wyoming is going to allow them to come and take our guns in violation of the Second Amendment or the Constitution. That just is not going to happen. Wyoming has very, our state constitution makes it very clear we have rights to protect ourselves. And I look at them and go, it's not going to happen. You will never see me join in that type of thing. You'll actually see me standing on the other side of the fence going, yeah, not here. That's not going to happen.
Well, I mean, Idaho, Wyoming, these Western states, we love our guns.
Yeah.
And I strongly believe, as a lot of people understand, that the Second Amendment was there. It's core principle of it. Somebody say, well, it's, I like to go shooting. I like to go hunting. Great. That's awesome. That's a big part of it, but that is not the point. The point of the Second Amendment is that an armed citizenry, and the founding fathers thought this through, an armed citizenry was there to keep the government from becoming tyrannical.
Yes.
Right? It's a stopgap. It's not saying that we can use it to go fight the government. No, it's prevention. And it works. And it's worked for 250 years. And I think it'll keep working. And people talk about, well, what happens when? Well, those are pretty extreme scenarios. I don't envision happening because there's no good economic reason for that to happen. Unless one extreme group has gone so far and taken over everything, which I don't see happening because, once again, the 80% rule. Most people are not okay with that. When you start pushing, people start to push back when they've taken enough. And so that just doesn't work here.
No, it doesn't. And quite frankly, if it ever got to that point, we're in a civil war. And it's like you say, how and why would we want to go there? Because, let's face it, you and I have talked to many people, and they have this glamorous idea of what happens if that actually takes place. That's nothing glamorous. People starve to death. Everything, society collapses. We will be a war zone. And people fail to remember that if we're at our own throats, somebody else will be at our throats very shortly.
Yeah,
And
as soon as people realize that they can't get their Instagram, their TikTok, their YouTube, they're like, no, we're good. Stop. Knock it off. Like, we'll go back to where they were. People like the way things are. I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing glamorous about this. And what we need to do is make sure we never get to that point. And that's the easiest thing, is because the founding fathers gave us this great tool called the vote. Stop electing what we're electing. And, again, I point out, Greg, the extremes on both sides have figured out that the majority of people don't vote in primaries. And that's where you end up with extremes in the general. I'm a veteran, United States Army veteran. Everybody always likes to come up and go, thank you for your service. And anymore, my response is this: no, don't thank me for that. I did that for you. Do you want to thank me? Then vote. Because your vote is the only thing that's going to protect and stabilize and save this country. You have to engage, you have to vote, and you have to vote for people that have the values that made this country what it is. And, the Democratic Socialist, Greg, they are communist. That's an easy research to do. They are communist, and we need to make sure that we understand what that means, because communism killed about 100 million people around the world because it doesn't work. It fails all the time, and those who get in power become tyrants. That has been the history of communism since Marx started it, and Marx started with socialism. Communism and socialism are the same thing, just different sides of the same coin. Marx was very clear that you ease people into communism through socialism.
Back to your experience and, being a sheriff, there's a label, and we've had a lot of conversations about this, and I haven't talked about this in a while. You've heard the term constitutional sheriff.
I have.
Think of that.
It gets thrown around a lot, and people don't even realize what the term constitutional sheriff is 9 times out of 10, because it actually has one statutory constitutional meaning, and then you have the extreme side of life that wants to paint it in a totally different way. Here's what a constitutional sheriff in the constitutional framework and statutory framework really is. A constitutional sheriff is a sheriff that office of sheriff is actually mentioned in the Constitution of the state that they're serving in, i.e., state of Washington. They had constitutional sheriffs because it says in the Constitution, each county shall elect a sheriff. Now, somehow the legislature has kind of monkeyed around with that, because you currently have one sheriff in Washington, King County, that is appointed because they went with a different style of local government. So I've always wondered why the Sheriff's Association there hasn't challenged that on a constitutional basis.
Interesting.
But then you come to Wyoming, and it says the legislature will decide what offices that will be elected in the county. So that's the true nature, statutory and constitutional nature. The other side of that is an individual formed a group, a club, and called themselves constitutional sheriffs, and they're really not constitutional sheriffs. Matter of fact, the person who started that is pretty much a charlatan. Yeah. He's not what he proclaims himself to be, and he was a former Democratic sheriff out of Arizona that has run for office under every banner I can think of, and he touts things that are nowhere near in the Constitution. So that's the two different types of constitutional sheriffs. Every sheriff I know, at least that I've ever worked with, and I've seen other sheriffs that have violated this principle, they stand with the Constitution, they stand for the Constitution, then they operate within the framework of the Constitution. Now, are there sheriffs that are out there that I have seen step into the wokeness? Yeah, I have. I've watched it. And at that point, that's where the citizen has this magic thing called the vote, and they can eliminate that type of sheriff.
And just for the audience, if you've heard this term and you've heard different versions of it, some of the ideas that the constitutional sheriffs groups promote are that, the sheriff is the highest authority in the land because they are elected, okay? And that the federal government has no policing authority, and therefore if the FBI were to come in to work on a case, they would have to be deputized by the sheriff to even be able to do anything. Like, That's not really how it works. But okay. These are the fringe thinking it, people twist their interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, and that's where some of these things come from. They get people behind it, get some support. And at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to how much money can they raise off of this and support their ongoing grift.
Exactly.
And I appreciate you clarifying that.
And one point, it's important to make about that is that every sheriff in the United States is bound to the United States Constitution and bound to the state constitution in which they serve. That means also the laws of both sides, state and federal, the court cases at both sides, state and federal. Those are the guardrails that the sheriff has to stay within. And if they don't, then the citizens need to take proper action and ensure that sheriff is removed from office. I mean, that's just as simple as it gets. And the sheriff is the chief law enforcement executive of the county that he's in. That's non-disputable. But they take it to a next level, and I've actually heard this: the sheriff has more power than the president of the United States. Now, that is not true.
Yeah.
And I challenge people when I hear that. I said, have you read the Constitution? And of course, they'll all say yes. I sometimes wonder about that, but they all say yes. And then you ask them this question: how many times is the office of sheriff mentioned in the Constitution?
Exactly.
And you hear crickets. The sheriff is very important. The sheriff is one of the most important elected officials in the county. But here's the thing that they also miss: not every state has sheriffs. They don't.
You know what I don't hear about is the constitutional coroner. The coroner is the one who actually has the authority to arrest the sheriff.
That's true.
That's an elected position, especially here in Idaho. It's like, why are we electing a coroner? A strange, weird little loophole thing. But yeah, coroners can arrest sheriffs.
Yeah. And one of the things that a lot of people miss about the sheriff also is not only is he bound by statutory regulations and laws, but he's also bound by common law. I mean, that common law reaches back 1,000 years of history in that. And, a lot of sheriffs sometimes don't understand what we talked about earlier. When the city of Spokane declared that they weren't going to investigate property crimes, there's actually case law referring back to common law that the sheriff must, it's not a may, must deal with that if the local jurisdiction can't or won't.
So I want to talk about a couple of things. We talked about the Second Amendment and arming yourself. And you'd mentioned to me before that, I remember we had a conversation where you said that the FBI came in and asked you to make sure your deputies were carrying an arm. And this comes into play because we saw this happen recently. There was an incident in Twin Falls, an active shooter situation that made national news. But what was interesting, and now you've seen all the memes of Idaho shoots back, because these people were armed. They defended themselves. They fought back. They shot back. And that probably saved a lot of lives. Now the Twin Falls police did an amazing job of showing end to end, like what happened with each, from surveillance video and body camera footage and it showed all the heroes, these just everyday Americans who just stood up. There was an off-duty, I believe it was an Idaho State police officer, pulled his sidearm and, helped defend the In-N-Out employees. Like the video of him in there rushing everyone to safety, and he exchanged bullets with the shooter. The other guy who got out of his vehicle and he had the suppressed 5.70 pulled out of his shoulder holster, and that shooting stance is famous, right? A guy who trained. Another woman who got out of her car and ran towards where the shooter was and picked up his firearm, although it was jammed and couldn't shoot, but she tried, right? That was an incredible amount of courage to do that. Like, people stepped up, and in the end, the police showed up and they chased him down, and he ended up, took his own life and fell into the ravine. A lot of lives were saved, I think, that day because the action of everyday citizens. It goes to this idea that, we have a responsibility, because at the end of the day, you as a law enforcement officer, from the moment you know about the incident to when you can respond, you're not there, right? It takes time, minutes or longer, to respond to a crime. I know the statistic, I live in Star, Idaho, and the police chief, I was at a Chamber of Commerce event, and the police chief was there talking, and he said that they have their response time in Star, which is a very small community, down to right under 2 minutes. And that's pretty impressive. But a lot can happen in 2 minutes, as we saw. Like, that whole shooting took place in a matter of minutes before the police could arrive. I mean, they were close. What are your thoughts on that?
You mentioned that I made that statement that my deputies would be carrying off duty. That was 2015, 2016 timeframe, I believe. The FBI did call us in, the leadership of the county, and went, the threat level has hit a certain level, and we highly recommend that all your staff carry with lots of ammunition. And, I get asked often, Greg, about carrying concealed or carrying, and my response back to citizens are, I highly recommend carrying. That's how I feel about it. I mean, the other side, the left always wants to say that there are very few shootings that get resolved because of an armed citizen, which isn't true. There are very many shootings that are either deterred or stopped by an armed citizen. And I highly recommend, carrying, but there's a caveat to that. I also recommend that if you're going to do that, make sure you're training, make sure you're safe with that weapon, and make sure that you understand how to use that weapon, when to use that weapon. And there's one thing that people, and you hear a lot of bravado around this. I'll do that. And let me tell you, you don't know what it's like until you send a round downrange. Now, thank goodness, 35 years and counting of doing this job, I haven't had to do that. I've been very close. I've had 3 pounds off a 3.5 pound trigger, but I've always been able to get the individual to put his guns down or the knife down or whatever it was that we were dealing with. But I've also seen the effects of what happens when that bullet goes downrange. And that's something you have to live with once that happens. And, we as a species are not designed to kill. Thank goodness. It's really, truly not in our makeup to kill another human. And especially if we've been raised in certain ways of thou shalt not kill. We have that little bit of a stopgap here. And in order to desensitize that stopgap when you join the military and things like that, there's training that we do to kind of, get that. But even in the military, the studies show that there's those who shoot and those who pray and shoot, if you know what I mean. And, there's different psychological boundaries to this. And there's a great book out there on killing by, I can't think of the author's name right now, but if you want to understand the dynamic around that, On Killing is a great book to read because it tells you about the effects and after effects of shooting.
Back to the idea of, we talked a lot about training, police work, putting the effort, and it sounds like you had a lot of focus on training, and it really showed. You had deputies who were passionate about their job, who cared about it, respected the community, and wanted to work hard, hence why you had an excellent rate at closing cases, especially homicide cases. But I want to talk about an issue that's come up a lot, and I see it everywhere. My social media feed is just filled with it. And it's this whole idea around these flock cameras. What are your thoughts on that? And did they help? Do they not help? Is it a problem? What do you think?
I can tell you that the Spokane area, they did have cameras, and we were able to solve and I'll just bring one incident into light, an attempted homicide, kidnapping. Husband tries to kill wife, takes kid, and because of the cameras, we actually were able to basically follow him all the way and find where he was with the kid, get there, and get the kid back. Without the cameras, that would have been much more delayed. It would have taken us a while, but at the same time, those cameras and my analysts were linked, and they were working the problem as fast as the detectives and patrol were working it, and we were able to get where we had to get. The thing about those type of cameras, though, is you have to have very, very strong constitutional guidelines, and I call them guardrails. If you don't, they could be abused. The thing that jurisdictions that have them and that we had was very, very strong, robust guidelines upon how they would be used, when they would be used. And, the Fourth Amendment means something. Those cameras fall under the purview of the Fourth, and you have to design your policies, procedures around those cameras based on the constitutional guidelines.
And as we know, there's more than 2 amendments.
Yeah.
The fourth is an important one. And so I appreciate the nuanced view on this because, we see so many people just saying like, we want to deflock Idaho, deflock this state. And it's funny because it's not just one group. I see
both the right and left.
Right. And then on the right,
exactly.
Remember the horseshoe. It's like this libertarian, and I wouldn't call it anti-government, but it's just like, oh, we want privacy. We all want privacy. Mm-hmm. And we also want security. And, there's the famous quote, those who are willing to sacrifice a little bit of privacy for some security, rights for security. That doesn't always play well. But
no, it doesn't.
We also need to look at, and I love the idea, this very conservative principle of local government, local control, where city council, and I saw this in actually was Idaho Falls did this, where they had a vote and they're like, hey, we're locking down, we have the cameras, but we're locking down so they can't be used. We can't sell the data. That data stays in here. No leaks, and it can't be commercialized or used for anything else. And really putting those constitutional guardrails around it. And I think that was done responsibly. And so if these things are done, and then of course you have the edge cases where you had someone pulled up 17 times to look at someone they were stalking online because they had access to the camera. It's like, that's clearly not okay. And, maybe these local governments need to not only put the guardrails on, but also enforce stricter if you get caught doing something like that. Make the consequence of abusing it so severe that you don't want to abuse it, right? That's a deterrent.
That would be a terminal offense to abuse that type of power.
Yeah, it's not okay. And so it's an interesting conversation I've seen being played out and watching who's saying what. And it always comes back to this idea of, and I'm sure you've heard this term. I remember it was the university president in Idaho who brought this up I want to say it was in the legislature or a very public statement, called them conflict entrepreneurs. And a conflict entrepreneur is someone who is taking a hot button issue, saying, you need to be angry about this and give me money so I can help you fight this.
You mean the ACLU?
There's a lot of
right? There are.
Yeah.
When the cameras first started coming out, man, at least 15 years ago, it was the ACLU that was the biggest one beating that drum. And over time, you've watched it go from they're still beating the drum, but now the drum's being beat over here also. And it really comes down to, and I get it, people don't trust the government anymore. And sadly, the way that our elected officials have acted over the years, I get that. I understand that. I mean, think about the COVID type periods. What do you mean? You're going to make me take a shot? Really? And they did. I remember in the state of Washington, the state had that mandate and they were firing state employees for not taking that shot. I was, on the other hand, hiring state troopers as rapidly as I could as they got fired from the state. And it's just amazing. And believe it or not, Greg, here in Sweetwater County, one of the main issues that I always hear people talk about is, what would you do under COVID? I mean, and I'm like, what happened here? And I've had business owners say, yeah, I had police officers come in and tell me that they were going to arrest me if I didn't shut the doors. And I'm like, that didn't even happen in the People's Republic of Washington. And
right, like no one enforced anything in Idaho. It was so few.
And I'm like, that's just amazing, because knowing who is responsible for coordinating those type of events, which is the sheriff, and knowing how we did it up there. I mean, the sheriff is in charge of the Department of Emergency Management. When COVID hit, we pulled all the electeds into a room. We pulled the doctors in charge of public health and public health director in, and we set the guidelines. And mine was, no one's getting arrested for not wearing a mask, not for keeping their business open, or churches for keeping their doors open. We're not going to do that. We'll educate people as far as what's going on. And when they started firing people for not taking a shot, I went to the Board of County Commissioners and went, just in the event you guys are thinking about doing what the state's doing, if that happens, I'm the first one that will resign. And Greg, I had taken the shot. I was in the military. I got a lot of different shots. I took the shot. I didn't have to take that stand, but there was no way that I was going to allow any of my personnel to be forced to make a choice between your job or taking the shot, because that is just so far out of the scope of what our country's supposed to be. And I'll tell you just how far it was. About 2 years later, I was in England on leadership and counterterrorism training. I have a friend that lives there, and we were visiting, and I told him about what happened to you. He looked at me and went, "You're an American. What happened to your liberty?" And Greg, there was nothing I could say. And he was right. What happened to our liberty? What happened was our elected leaders decided to push something that they should never have pushed. And they all knew in July of 21, the shot did not work. They knew that. And they continued to push it. And then they started taking people's jobs away. It's unanswerable what happened during that.
And my stance was, look, if people wanted something like, okay, I'm scared, can this shot potentially help or protect me? Look at your own personal health risks or whatever. Take it,
Exactly.
don't take it.
It's your
That's
choice.
personal choice. And you know what? It's available. Great. You should be able to choose that. But a government mandate, no, that's a very different thing. That's not the same. That is the antithesis of personal liberty. And we talk about the idea of bodily autonomy. The government should not regulate what goes in or out of you, right? That's what I think.
Exactly.
And yet we see those lines get blurred all the time, depending on a certain ideology, because that covers a lot of different things, not just shots. So it's fascinating, it's nuanced, and I appreciate your take on it because you're right. This erosion of personal liberty, that's where more and more of it happens, right? People have good economic reasons to keep things the way they are, but at the same time, that's a driving force for some erosions of personal liberties. And that's where we get to the point where, okay, the government's, is it going too far or not? We need to vote, right? That is the most important thing we can do to fix that. I love this conversation. I always like talking with you. You're running for sheriff of Sweetwater County in Wyoming.
I am.
And you're born and raised there. You've come back there, and there's an opportunity to fix some of the drug problems and things that are there, fill those gaps. If elected, what would you like to see done? What would you like to do as sheriff?
One of the first things that we're going to do is actually form a drug unit because they don't have one. Greg, they don't have an accredited evidence room or forensics unit, which in the 21st century, I've never heard of that. So that has to be fixed. The agency itself is not accredited. So we have to fix that issue. Training, as you know, is one of my fortes. It's one of the things I stress. We're going to try to build the same type of training philosophy here as we had in my last agency. And more importantly, we're going to make sure that we reach out to the public, because one of the things I've heard across the county is, are you going to show up? Are you going to actually answer my phone call if I call you? Are you going to return that phone call? And that is a definitive. That's where I worked in my prior jurisdiction. I was in the public all the time. As you know, I was all over, and that has to be that way. But most importantly, the people have to feel safe, because at the fair, I had a mother walk up to me holding an infant, and she said, I've talked to all your opponents. You're the last one, and I want to know. And she said, my son will be 4 years old at the end of your first term. What are you going to do to take the drugs off his street and protect him? There is no way that a mother in any jurisdiction should be asking that question, because she should know that her sheriff's office is out there protecting their families and protecting their children and making their community the safest it can be. So that is the top line. We are going to be the safest community in the state of Wyoming.
I'd vote for you after hearing that. But I don't get to vote in Sweetwater County. There's some constitutional rules around that, but that's okay. I think the voters there in Sweetwater County have an important choice to make here. The election is the 18th. Is that correct? This is the
18th.
Wyoming Republican primary on August 18th. Encourage everyone who's eligible to go and vote. Thank you, Ozzie, so much for joining me. It's always a joy to talk to you. I have so much fun, and I learned so much from you over the years. And I know many times I've reached out to you for advice on certain issues, and you've always been very helpful, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, thank you. Been my pleasure.
Well, thank you. All right. Thanks for listening to another episode of Political Potatoes. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, the usual things. Thank you.